Hello again. So I'm recording this video in order to help you read and understand the first few pages of Volume 1 of Foucault's History of Sexuality, the first part of the book, which is entitled We Other Victorians. A quick remark before I start. If you do not yet have a copy of the bookstore is offering you to post the book to your home address. Have a quick look under lecturer announcements where I've reproduced a message that I received from the bookstore with, as I just said, the bookstore's offer to post books needed for the second half of the semester out to students. So, one of the advantages of reading Foucault is the fact that he writes well. Now, Heidegger also writes well, but, and we talked about this a number of times, he's very difficult to translate into English because of his way of emphasizing the etymology of German terms in a way that's impossible really to capture in an English translation. Foucault's French is much more straightforward, though highly literary, but the, literary qualities of his work, or Foucault's literary talent, does come through very nicely in this English translation. So it's fun to read Foucault simply because he knows how to use words. Okay. So the pages that we're looking at, so it's 3 to 13, are not many, just about 10 pages, but the text is rather dense and makes a number of points, gives an overview of the whole argument of the book in a very compressed way. So let me try to capture the main points of these first 10 pages or so. Roughly into how many sections do these first 10 pages fall? That's to say, if I were asked to subdivide the text, how would I do this? Well, I would say on pages 3 to 5, Foucault first gives a very quick, obviously very quick, it's just a couple of pages, summary of the standard account of how we have in our Western civilization treated sexuality from the 17th century to the present day. And he distinguishes 3 phases there, about which I'm going to talk in a second. Then on pages roughly 6 to 8, he tries to explain why this standard account, one could perhaps say why this standard narrative, has proven so successful. What is it that makes it so powerful, such that so many people have embraced it without question? That's roughly pages 6 to 8, and then in the final few pages of the first part, roughly 8 to 13, 8 to the end, Foucault sketches his own project. What is it really that he is trying to do in this book, that is to say in Volume 1 of the History of Sexuality, but more broadly, what is the project that he is trying to pursue in the several volumes of the History of Sexuality. So, 3 parts. Let me make a few remarks about the first section here. The first section, I just said pages 3 to 5, distinguishes 3 phases in the way in which Western civilization has treated sexuality from the 17th century to now. But distinguishes 3 phases. I should put this differently. Foucault offers a summary of the standard narrative, that is to say, he distances himself from this, which may not be, well, which is obvious perhaps, which is obvious really from the first sentence if you look at it. For a long time, the story goes, we supported a Victorian regime and we continue to be dominated by it even today. If you read carefully, the 3 words there, the story goes, alert you, these 3 words alert you to the fact that what Foucault is summarizing here in the first few pages is not his own theory, but is rather the standard account which he wants to challenge. Now, in this standard account, there is a distinction of 3 phases. What's the first phase? He says, the first phase ends roughly at the beginning of the 17th century. And to summarize, Why don't I simply read you the one paragraph in which Foucault attempts to capture the gist of our attitudes, our means Western civilization, attitudes to sexuality up to the 17th century. At the beginning of the 17th century, he writes, a certain frankness was still common, it would seem. Sexual practices had little need of secrecy, words were said without undue reticence, and things were done without too much concealment. One had a tolerant familiarity with the illicit. Codes regulating the coarse, the obscene, and the indecent were quite lax compared to those of the 19th century. It was a time of direct gestures, shameless discourse, and open transgressions, when anatomies were shown and intermingled at will, and knowing children hung about amid the laughter of adults. It was a period when bodies made a display of themselves. So far the standard account. Then in the next paragraph, Foucault starts talking about the 19th century. This raises an interesting question. So what has happened to the 18th? I mean, either in the standard account or in Foucault's representation of the standard account. So up to the 17th century, sexuality was not repressed. It enjoyed a certain freedom. And in the 19th century, in Victorian times, it comes to be repressed. So what about the 18th? There's nothing said here. Well, it's all very compressed. It's all very short. But still, that's certainly a critical question I would ask myself. Where has the 18th century gone? Anyway, so the first phase, the 17th century, which are just summarized in Foucault's own words here. I'm reading you Foucault's words because, given how well he writes, it's difficult to say it any better. I mean, I could paraphrase, obviously, but then it would also be a pity not to let Foucault himself speak, given the fact that he expresses himself so exceptionally well. So, up to the 17th century, this first phase of relative sexual freedom. Then in the Victorian age, the picture changes. In the Victorian age, repression begins. How does this repression of sexuality manifest itself? Well, how does Foucault summarize this here? The conjugal family took custody of it being sexuality, and absorbed it into the serious function of reproduction. On the subject of sex, silence became the rule. The legitimate and procreative couple laid down the law. So in the Victorian times, this previously free attitude with regard to sexuality is replaced by silence. We are no longer allowed to laugh about sexual matters. It all becomes very, very serious. And a certain freedom in regard to one's own sexual activities, one's own sexual life, is replaced by very strict rules as to when sexuality can legitimately be pursued. And the only place is in the home, and with the goal of reproduction pursued by a couple. Okay. At the same time, Foucault points out on page 4, in the Victorian age, the idea appears that children have no sex, which, he says, before the Victorian age was not the standard assumption, and which also afterwards with Freud is no longer the assumption. Okay. Where does this title, We Other Victorians, come from? Well, if you've asked yourself that question, the answer appears towards the bottom of page 4, where Foucault cites one Stephen Marcus, who speaks of other Victorians. Foucault points out that as sexuality comes to be more rigidly regulated in the Victorian age, there are nonetheless places where the illicit or the transgressive was still able to occur. And this is the place where the other Victorians, where the marginalized Victorians, where the repressed side of the Victorian age manifested itself. He mentions here the brothel and the mental hospital would be those places of tolerance. The prostitute, the client, and the pimp, together with the psychiatrist and the hysteric, are the places where, in the Victorian age, transgressive sexuality, illicit sexuality occurs. It occurs in the context of psychiatric treatments, where patients talk about their sexual urges and their sexual fantasies, and at the same time in the brothel, where people act out a type of sexuality which in mainstream society is not considered legitimate. So much about the second phase. So up to the 17th century, then in the 19th century this repressive age begins, And then, according again to the standard account, again, I draw your attention to the three words in the very, very first line of the chapter, the story goes. So Foucault is still simply summarizing the standard account. Then, I guess towards the middle of the 20th century, he doesn't say this explicitly, but he associates with Freud, so we're talking about the beginning of the 20th century, an increasing challenging of the Victorian repression occurred in a movement of sexual liberation, which, according to Foucault, has continued up to the present day. What are the major characteristics of this lifting of repression, of this rebelling against repression? Well, let me read you one sentence here from page 5. We are informed that if repression has indeed been the fundamental link between power, knowledge, and sexuality since the classical age, it stands to classical age, by the way, in a kind of French sense of the term, not in the sense of classical age meaning antiquity. We are informed that if repression has indeed been the fundamental link between power, knowledge, and sexuality since the classical age, it stands to reason that we will not be able to free ourselves from it except at a considerable cost. So how are we now trying to throw off this yoke of repression? Well, nothing less than a transgression of laws becomes necessary, a lifting of prohibitions, an eruption of speech, a reinstating of pleasure within reality, and a whole new economy in the mechanisms of power will be required. So according to Foucault, these are some of the major, this summarizes the major thrust of an era of sexual liberation. Restrictive laws need to be transgressed, prohibitions lifted, freedom of speech promoted, eruption of speech is what he says, and we have to reinstate pleasure within reality, that is to say, assert that we have the right to sexual pleasure against those Victorians who were always trying to repress us. I now move on to pages, bottom of page 5 to about page 8. In this second section of the first, chapter, it's really called the first part, as you know, Foucault tries to state very briefly why this standard narrative regarding the three phases we just distinguished, relative sexual freedom, repression, and liberation from repression, why this narrative, why this standard account has been so successful, why everyone believes in it. He gives two reasons. The first reason is the explanation works well within the context of a theory of capitalism. It works well within the context of a theory of capitalism in conjunction with the bourgeois order. So if we believe that in the 20th century capitalism and the bourgeois order are central social features, and also if we're interested in critiquing them, then this account of sexuality in terms of repression and rebellion against repression works very well. Why does it work very well? Well, because of the standard account, one assumes that, and I quote, top of page 6, if sex is so rigorously repressed, this is because it is incompatible with a general and intensive work imperative. So, in capitalism, everyone is made to work as much as possible. Capitalism relies on the exploitation of people's labor. Now, to best exploit people's labor, so the story goes, again, it is best to repress their sexual urges or to challenge them very narrowly, because otherwise people play around sexually instead of working hard. So you can see that this standard theory of sexuality works very well within, not so much a theory of capitalism as within a certain theory and critique of capitalism, first. Secondly, why is this theory of repression and liberation, or this narrative of liberation, of repression and liberation, so satisfying? It's so satisfying because it places the one holding this theory in a very attractive role. In the role of, Foucault is quite explicit here, the prophet and the preacher. I'll read you again a couple of passages, just because Foucault does say things so well. Page 6, about half from the top of the page. If sex is repressed, that is, condemned to prohibition, non-existence and silence, then the mere fact that one is speaking about it has the appearance of a deliberate transgression. So, within this standard narrative, the one who speaks up against sexual repression is somebody who is very courageous, who is transgressive, by asserting his or her sexuality, by asserting the rights to sexual pleasure, etc., etc. And this, well, I mean, it's a very satisfying role for someone to be able to appear with a great, as Foucault says, solemnity. This explains the solemnity with which one speaks of sex nowadays. It's a very, very important task to liberate us all. On page 7, there are two really interesting and notable sentences. Some of the ancient functions of prophecy are reactivated therein. Now, therein refers to this discourse regarding sexuality which demands liberation. If I demand liberation from sexual repression, I speak with an almost prophetic voice about what, really? Well, revolution and happiness. Revolution and a different body, a freer body, a liberated body, one that is newer and more beautiful. Indeed, revolution and pleasure. Towards the bottom of page 7, today it is sex that serves as a support for the ancient form of preaching. So likewise, with this demand to enact liberation from sexual repression, I can place myself in the role of the preacher, but not a preacher of traditional religious values, but rather a preacher for the overthrowing of, this repressive Victorian regime, as we all look forward to a more liberated age. For those of you who are interested in reading the text in a little bit more depth, this is not something I'm going to pursue here now. Note the very interesting reference on lines 2 and 3 of page 8 to the Franciscans. The Franciscans are called to mind. Why the Franciscans? In connection with the idea of prophecy and a new liberated age. Now, Foucault knew what he was talking about here, but I'm just throwing it out to you here as a challenge. If you're interested in pursuing this further and doing some additional research, look, if you're interested in doing something like a master's thesis, why not? Why is Foucault here referring to the Franciscans? I now come to the final few pages of this introductory section, pages 8 to 13. In which Foucault offers a very quick and rough overview of what he himself wants to argue in this book, in this series of books. Let me begin again by reading a couple of sentences to you, which draw attention to the paradox that got Foucault to question the standard account. What is this paradox? Briefly, he writes on page 8, my aim is to examine the case of a society which has been loudly castigating itself for its hypocrisy for more than a century, which speaks verbosely of its own silence, takes great pains to relate in detail the things it does not say, denounces the powers it exercises, and promises to liberate itself from the very laws that have made it function. So, perhaps the most striking paradox here is we speak verbosely of our own silence. So we keep saying our attitude with regard to sexuality is so repressed, so terribly repressed. As we assert this way in which we're still terribly repressed, we talk about it all the time. So that makes Foucault, of course, question. So if we're all that repressed, and if so much still needs to be done in order to bring sexual liberation about, how come we're not talking about anything else? Is that really repression? So, again, another way in which he summarizes his own project, page 9. It is certainly legitimate to ask why sex was associated with sin for such a long time. So he doesn't deny that sex was associated with sin. By the way, that's now the first time that he brings in the category of sin here, to which he's going to return later in the book. It is certainly legitimate to ask why sex was associated with sin for such a long time. ... I'm omitting a few lines, but we must also ask why we burden ourselves today with so much guilt for having once made sex a sin. Or another way in which Foucault summarizes the question that he wants to ask in this book, it's a little bit earlier, pages 8 to 9. The question I would like to pose is not, why are we repressed, but rather, why do we say, with so much passion and so much resentment against our most recent past, against our present, and against ourselves, that we are repressed? So, the question he wants to ask is, where does this whole discourse regarding repression come from? Now, the opening pages make it clear, but only in an initial way, that Foucault is not happy with the standard account. But he's not, and so he's obviously, in the pages that follow, going to offer a critique of the standard account. Right now, he in the first few pages of the book, he can't give a detailed critique. What he does, however, and I turn now to page 10, is that he asks a few critical questions, which he says he wants to pursue in the book. Critical questions regarding what, on page 10, first full paragraph, he calls the repressive hypothesis. The repressive hypothesis, that's a phrase which summarizes this narrative of the three steps. So the 17th century, the 19th century, the liberation. What is it that about the repressive hypothesis he doesn't find quite satisfying? First question he asks, page 10, is sexual repression truly an established historical fact? Is what first comes into view really the accentuation or even the establishment of a regime of sexual repression beginning in the 17th century? So he wants to say, let's look at the historical record and see that after the 17th century there is really a repression occurring, such that we see, for example, previously lots of accounts of sexual activity or novels in which, sex is talked about, etc., and then there's suddenly a silence. He wants to say, let's see if this is true. He calls this is a properly historical question. It's a question for historical research. Second doubt that he has regarding the standard theory: do the workings of power, and in particular those mechanisms that are brought into play in societies such as ours, really belong primarily to the category of repression? Are prohibition, censorship, and denial truly the forms through which power is exercised in a general way, if not in every society, most certainly in our own? So, this leads us, this mention of power leads us to the heart of Foucault's project, in the history of sexuality, but also in this phase of his own work, which is the late phase. History of Sexuality is the last major work that Foucault composed before he died. So how does power work? We're going to discover later on in the book, or throughout the book, that Foucault has a theory in this book, not just regarding sexuality, but regarding the way in which power works in modern societies. What he wants to question is an idea according to which power is primarily repressive. What does it mean to have power? It means to repress people. It means to prevent people from doing stuff, sexual stuff, but also all kinds of other stuff. Okay. Foucault is going to suggest in this book that in modern societies power works in a much more indirect, in a much more subtle, in a much more productive way. Power, instead of repressing us, shapes us. So if you ask Foucault, how does a modern government work? Does it work by repressing us? Or does it work by trying to shape the way in which we act positively? But Foucault would say the older form of power, this repressive type of power, obtained in pre-modern times. In modern contemporary times, power is much more a power that tries to shape us. Okay, that of course would mean then that if Foucault is right, then sexuality is not being repressed, let's say in contemporary society, but is rather being shaped by power. Okay, so second point that he makes here. The third point, the third doubt that he raises with regard to the standard account is this. Was there really a historical rupture between the age of repression and the critical analysis of repression? So the point here is this. In the standard account, sexual repression and liberation are presented as being opposites. First, there was the Victorian repression, and now, 20th century, 21st century, we live in an age of sexual liberation. So, in the Victorian age, there's a no to sex. No, sex is bad, sex is embarrassing, sex is something that should occur only, really, in a heterosexual couple in the house for the purposes of reproduction. Liberated sex says, no, there are many, many different forms of sexuality, not just the straight couple, and sex is certainly not only for reproduction, etc., etc. So, normally this is taken to be, well, a very straightforward matter of yes and no. The older type of sexual discourse is repressive, it says no to sex. The more contemporary type of discourse is liberating and it says yes to sex. And so normally a rupture is posited there. Foucault asks, is there really such a rupture? Or is it perhaps one could also put this differently. Remember how often we have now talked about the Kantian box, okay? The box of the a priori, the box of how the human mind shapes its understanding of reality. See, the question that Foucault asks here is it the case that in relation to sexuality, one box has replaced another box, a new box has superseded an older box, or is it rather the case that both the repressive talk and the talk about liberation belong to the same type of framework that human beings have used to conceptualize sexuality? That's what he wants to argue. That's what he's suggesting here tentatively. That's what he wants to argue in this book. In order to understand what Foucault is on page 11 trying to summarize the gist of his book in a couple of sentences that I would like to quote to you. The central issue then, at least in the first instance, and this summarizes what I just said or illustrates what I just said about the saying no or saying yes to sex. So, center of page 11. The central issue then, at least in the first instance, is not to determine whether one says yes or no to sex. The central issue is not to determine whether one says yes or no to sex, whether one formulates prohibitions or permissions, whether one asserts its importance or denies its effects, or whether one refines the words one uses to designate it. Okay. So he says that's not the most important issue. He's interested in, because he doubts that this is pertinent. So what does he want to ask in the history of sexuality? The central issue is to account for the fact that it is spoken about. Why is sexuality spoken about at all? Either negatively or positively. Account for the fact that it is spoken about. Was it always spoken about? Was it always such a major point of interest that people were talking about incessantly? Account for the fact that it is spoken about. To discover who does the speaking. So who talks about sex in contemporary society? Who is authorized to talk? Is it the doctor? Is it the physician? Is it the priest? Is it the psychoanalyst? Is it whoever? But he says, well, now that's very interesting to find out. The positions and viewpoints from which they speak, from what theoretical backgrounds do these people come from, who in our contemporary society are endowed with this authority, with this power to speak about sexuality, and the institutions which prompt people to speak about it, and which store and distribute the things that are said. So in what, against what institutional background, in what institutions does the contemporary discourse regarding sexuality take place? So what Foucault is interested in are the fundamental structures which are the fundamental ways in which the discourse regarding sexuality is structured, both in these so-called repressive and in these so-called liberating discourses, because he wants to suggest that there is a common structure which underlies them. So the categories that I just mentioned to you, or that came up as I read the paragraph from Foucault there to you, or the few lines from Foucault to you, relate to what Foucault himself would call an analysis of discourse. In order to understand the discourse regarding sexuality, one has to ask who speaks, from what point of view, or from what background, and within what institutions. So again, see, I'm trying to summarize this for you. Let's replace, Foucault is arguing, let's replace this struggle, this battle which is still ongoing. Are we going to say yes to sex, or are we going to say no to sex? Because perhaps that is only a struggle in the foreground that doesn't get to the essence of things, doesn't get to the bottom of what is at stake here. Let's replace this with a discursive analysis of why we are talking about sex at all, and what the fundamental factors are which structure that discourse regarding sexuality. And as he says in this paragraph, so who speaks, from what theoretical point of view, and thirdly, from what kind of institutional position. Okay? Final couple of pages here, 12 and 13. Foucault formulates the new understanding of power that he wants to argue for in this book. If you read the bottom of page 12, a first survey made from this viewpoint seems to indicate that since of the end of the 16th century, the putting into discourse of sex, so you see that's how his focus has now shifted. We're no longer talking about repression or liberation, but we're talking about putting into discourse of sex, whether positively or negatively. How has this, far from undergoing a process of restriction or repression, on the contrary been subjected to a mechanism of increasing incitement? He wants to argue that the techniques of power exercised over sex have not obeyed a principle of rigorous selection, repression, of selecting between what is legitimate and what is illegitimate, but rather one of dissemination and implantation of polymorphous sexualities, and that the will to knowledge has not come to a halt in the face of a taboo that must not be lifted, but has persisted in continuity, despite many mistakes, of course, but has persisted in continuing, despite many mistakes, of course, a science of sexuality. So, in these lines, Foucault summarizes the conception of power that he wants to argue. The power of modern societies works not by repression, but works by regulating people's behavior, not stopping behavior, but channeling it into certain ways. So in his argument here is that's what has happened with sexuality. It's not that repression has occurred, but rather dissemination has occurred of discourse, but also implantation of polymorphous sexualities. So it's not that our sexuality has been repressed, but it has been implanted in us in a polymorphous, multifaceted, what other synonym is there for polymorphous, way. Okay, so I hope that's my summary of part 1 of the history of sexuality. I hope you found it useful for your own reading of the text. Thank you for listening and for watching me. And I look forward to reading... I have to give you an assignment. I look forward to reading the next pages with you. So your assignment for Monday is to start reading part 2. I'm saying start reading part 2. Part 2 extends from page 15. Yeah, it's really page 17 to page 49. So that's quite a few pages. I am not sure I can summarize all these pages for you just in one lecture for Monday. But please start reading this second part 2 of the book. And on Monday, we will see how far I will be able to get myself in a video lecture of about 30, or today it is 35 minutes. Have a good weekend, and I look forward to recording another video for you early next week. Goodbye.